Hi, welcome to Justice Labs, the world's go-to resource for research regarding international justice systems. We have all the answers here, trust me. I am a science person. When studying international justice systems, we first have to ask 3 questions. Question number 1, what is a justice system supposed to do? Question number 2, what does a justice system actually do? And question number 3, how does it do it? Luckily, justice systems all over the world are completely different, and so are the societies in which they're placed, which means that we can study all these different systems and compare and contrast them all to find out which things work and which things don't. But first, we got to figure out, what the hell is the justice system for? 1 second. Wait, what the hell? Wasn't supposed to turn the whole lights off. So the general public perception of prison is that it's a preventative measure. If harsh sentences, harsh jails equals lower crime rates. It makes sense when you think about it. I mean, if we make jails the most unpleasant places on earth, then people will do everything in their power to avoid going there. Right? Well, let's see. Despite only having 4% of the world's population, the USA has almost a quarter of the world's prisoners. That's the highest incarceration rate in the entire world. Congratulations, America, you are world champions at this. Or to put it another way, in no other country in the entire world are you more likely to go to jail than in the one which refers to itself as the land of the free. You'd think that with the highest chances of going to jail, that America would have the lowest crime rate, but you'd think wrong. Actually, America ranks mid-table or higher for almost every single crime category. The US murder rate, for example, is 94th highest in the entire world. Now you might be thinking, well, that doesn't sound so bad, 94 sounds kind of like mid-table, and you'd be right, it is kind of mid-table. But it is a higher murder rate than places like Somalia, Pakistan, Libya and Syria. And those stats are after adjusting for the differences in population size. It kind of seems like just the threat of going to prison really doesn't deter people from committing crimes. But maybe that's just because America has really soft prison systems, which are actually quite enjoyable. It's like going to a Hilton, I guess. Well, according to the Department of Justice, US prisons have been found guilty of a number of different, very negative and unpleasant things, such as they have been found guilty of not preventing the following things: assault, rape, stabbing, and illegal drug use. And in addition to that, the Department of Justice has also found many prisons across the US to be guilty of not only not supplying treatment for mental health conditions, but actually failing to recognize that a person has a mental health condition at all. And considering 50% of US inmates actually suffer from a mental health condition, this is a big one. So American jails sound like exactly the kind of hellholes that we all assume prevents crime, but they don't. I want to preface this by saying that there is a reason for this statistical anomaly, or at least one reason for it, and that is down to how America categorizes crime. See, some things that America calls a crime, other countries simply call a misdemeanor. So carrying a small amount of marijuana for personal use, for example, in most other countries just gets you a warning on first offense, it gets you a fine on second offense, and then you might be facing jail time on the 3rd time. In America, however, it's jail on the first time offense in many states. The case for jail as a deterrent actually starts to get shakier when we start to look at capital crime and how capital crime is punished. The USA executes the 6th highest amount of criminals in the entire world. That's more executions than Somalia and Pakistan, but yet the USA's murder rate is higher than both. Well, how can that be? If the ultimate punishment would be the ultimate deterrent, then surely that shouldn't happen. But I understand what you might be thinking, and that's that Pakistan, Somalia, these places are very different to the United States in terms of culture, education, socioeconomic status. So maybe that's, the reason for this difference in statistics. So what about if we compare it to a country that is comparable in all of those factors, like the UK? The UK's murder rate is significantly lower than the US, even when accounting for population size difference, even though we haven't executed anybody here since 1964. In the USA, 36% of all criminals released from prison are back there again within 2 years. In the UK it's 47%, in Australia it's 39%, in Germany it is 45%, in Canada it's 35%, and in Chile it's 50%. In fact, in almost every single country studied, the figure is always 31% or higher. That's almost a third of all criminals that go into the justice system and they're then released, come back into it again within 2 years. But not all countries. Norway, in fact, has only a 20% recidivism rate. The question is why? People looking at this will correctly state that Norway is actually quite a small country. In fact, it has only just under 5.5 million people living there. And the people who look at this will obviously say, well, actually this population size is much smaller and much easier to control. And that's the reason for the much lower recidivism rate. What those people won't say is that in the mid-1970s, Norway actually had a 70% recidivism rate. And back then, Norway had a prison system very similar to the United States. Around about the early to mid-90s, the rate started to drop significantly until it hit 20% and it stayed there ever since. Singapore also had recidivism rates similar to the rest of the world. It hovered around 40%. Like Norway, they also had a system just like American and just like the UK. And like Norway, around the mid-90s, they started to change their system and thinking a little bit. And the recidivism rate started to drop until it hit its all-time low of 22% in February this year. Now you might be thinking that, well, these countries are very different to the US, both in terms of size, in terms of culture, socioeconomic status, education, and maybe that's the reason why there's such a big difference between these countries and the USA. So what if we take a more representative example? Are there any places in the US that are doing something similar and experiencing similar results? Actually, yes. Michigan in the United States decided 10 years ago to change their system from their older style system based around punishment to something different and started to experience a drop in recidivism there too, and it's now at 27%, which is the lowest recidivism rate in the entire United States of America. So what are they doing? Well, they're doing things like giving real education programs to inmates to help them get jobs once they're released. They give them access to easy housing once they're released from the prison system. They also issue them with a free government-provided state ID or driver's license if they've passed their test. They also have access to free ongoing drug treatment programs for as long as they need it. According to Lieutenant Governor Garvin Gilchrist II, yeah, I know, it's not two, it's the second, but I kind of think it's funny to think of him as the sequel to his dad. Anyway, Lieutenant Governor Garvin Gilchrist II has stated that actually the goal of Michigan's prison system isn't to punish anyone, it's to help them. In 2019, researchers from Albany, Michigan, and California all decided to conduct a 10-year longitudinal study of the prison system to look at what kind of an effect incarceration rates had on recidivism rates in those states. After a 10-year study of 3 different states spanning multiple different prison systems, what they found was that actually the higher the incarceration rate, the higher the recidivism rate too. Now this was in complete contradiction to what they were expecting to find. What they were expecting to find is that when the incarceration rate increased, the recidivism rate would decrease. But actually they found the opposite was slightly true. And the recidivism rates were slightly higher when incarceration rates were higher too. So if long hard jail time doesn't prevent crime, then what about, as we've just seen, jail doesn't do all that much to correct criminal behavior. But that's not to say that it's completely useless, because we have to remember that 50 to 65% of people that go into the prison system never come back again. So it clearly does work for some people, and there are some anecdotal reports of people saying that prison was so horrible that they did everything they could to make sure they never had to go back again. But let's be honest, 50%, that's a coin toss. That could just be blind luck. So can we really rely on that to be the standard that we should all strive towards? So what does the current system actually do to correct criminal behavior? Actually, I spent a full week researching this, and you'd be surprised how difficult it is to find information on this particular subject. Lots of prison systems and government websites make vague allusions to things like a work program or an education program, but very few of those websites, almost none in fact, actually detail what those programs entail. There is a reason for that, but it'll become more apparent as this video goes on. So the education system is one which provides basic adult literacy and numeracy skills to inmates with the view to getting them to pass their high school diploma. In about a third of American prisons, there are programs to help inmates get access to degree-level education. But unfortunately, a legislation passed in 1994 made it illegal for prisoners to access government funding for education programs while they were in jail. And since they couldn't afford to pay for these programs themselves, because they're in jail, these programs hardly ever get used. In fact, the rate of usage is about as close to 0% as it can be without actually being 0%. There are also some life skills classes which are taught to prisoners. These basically entail teaching someone how to turn up for an interview, how to dress for an interview, how to write a resume, how to turn on a computer and send an email. I'm not taking the piss with these. They are genuinely that fucking stupid. It's completely insulting to even the dumbest person's intelligence. But when you consider that an inmate leaving prison is going to be applying for only the crappiest jobs with the crappiest wages and the crappiest conditions, and they're going to be competing against people that don't have a criminal history, you have to ask yourself just how useful a high school diploma and a gold star in interview class is really going to be. The work program in the United States is not what it sounds like. The way that the work program is pitched is that prisoners will learn applicable job skills by working a trade while they're in prison. Sounds neat, right? Except all the prisoners are really doing is labor chores. They're shifting things back and forth, they are cleaning the prison, they are doing laundry, or they're being sent to an actual prison labor camp to do actual manual labor. So if they're not learning any transferable life skills that are going to help them when they leave prison, then why the hell are we giving them these jobs in the first place? Yeah, this is going to be an unpopular answer because capitalism is almost a religion in the United States, so I feel the heat already from you guys, but stick with me, okay? Whether you like it or not, capitalism is definitely contributing to the prison problem in the United States. The reason for this is that inmates are being used as a $1 a day labor force by huge corporations who are using this feature of the correction system to increase their bottom line and their profits by employing prison labor instead of good, average, hard-working Americans just like yourselves. That's right. Your jobs aren't being given to illegal immigrants, they're not even being sent overseas. Your jobs are being given to inmates for $1 a day. That's a price so low that even illegal immigrants won't work for it. What chance does the average American have against that? Some of these huge corporations include Microsoft, Victoria's Secret, Walmart, Nintendo, McDonald's, Coke Industries, and Costco. And that isn't even the whole list, that's just the most eye-catching names. The list is far longer. There is another side of the privatization of the prison system which is definitely contributing to the crime problem in the United States. And that is that prisons themselves are now private institutions in many states. Those institutions are being paid huge sums of money to imprison people and keep them safe. The more prisoners that those prisons have, the more money the prison makes. So there's an actual profit incentive to have more prisoners in jail. In 2006, 2 Luzerne County judges were found guilty of accepting kickbacks in exchange for sentencing youth offenders for long stints in youth corrections facilities, even if it was a first-time offense. Now, if the Luzerne County youth corrections system wasn't privatized, that profit incentive wouldn't be there and that situation would never have occurred. A privatized system also has an obligation to grow in order to make more money. In fact, if you ask any businessman all over the world what their goal is for the coming year, they'll all say the same thing. Growth, baby. That's what profits is all about, growth. You have to grow eternally. But for a prison system, that means consistently finding people to put in jail. During the 1980s, there were 2 big changes that occurred, but it's very difficult to determine which one was the cause and which one was the effect. So I just want you to keep that in mind as we explore this. Ronald Reagan instituted his infamous War on Drugs campaign, and prison populations boomed as a result of it. At the same time, legislation was created and passed to create America's very first privatized prison. Did Reagan start his aggressive campaign in order to justify the creation of privatized prisons? Or did privatized prisons come into existence to accommodate all the extra prisoners that were going to be going into the system? It's a difficult thing to unravel, but this might help. The oldest private prison contractor in the US is a company called CoreCivic. which were formerly called Corrections Corporation of America. They were founded in 1983 by Thomas Beasley and T. Don Hutto. Thomas Beasley was the chairman of the Tennessee Republican Party. T. Don Hutto was the incoming president of the American Correctional Association, the governing body for the entire prison system in the United States. So that was 1983. 1 year later, in 1984, Ronald Reagan instituted his War on Drugs campaign with his new policy, the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984. Private prison created in 1983, War on Drugs campaign created in 1984, thereby increasing the population size of prisons and also providing a lot of juicy government contracts to those private prison contractors who were now going to be totally necessary. Yeah, it's a real head scratcher. So if prisons don't deter crime all that much and they don't correct crime all that much, then why the hell do we put people in prison? The answer mostly is punishment, or to give it its fancy science man name, retributive justice. The reason we have prisons is largely to make the public feel as if justice has been served. The public by and large wants to see criminals having things taken away from them, to reflect the fact that they did it to someone else. The greater the crime, the more things that the public wants to see the criminal have taken away from them. Eye for an eye, that kind of thing. You could also make the argument that prisons and jail exist as a method of removing a violent individual from the public and therefore reducing the possibility of that violent individual affecting someone else. But that only works if you're actually correcting that behavior. Considering it's a coin toss, there's a 50% chance that all you're doing is moving that problem from one point in time to a future point in time. This is only really my conjecture here, but I really do think that part of the reason, if not the main reason, that the prison systems are as they still are, is largely because people see it as a form of legalized revenge. People often argue that victims and their families need to see the prisoner punished in order to feel a sense of closure and justice. But just how true is that? According to Robert Mueller in Psychology Today, he conducted a study in Minnesota where he looked at how families felt after seeing the criminal receive their punishment. In this case, it was the death penalty for capital crimes. What he found was that only 2.5% of families actually felt a sense of closure after witnessing the criminal get the death penalty. Robert Mueller interviewed all these people beforehand too and asked them how they thought they were going to feel after the prisoner was put to death. Almost all of these families and victims said that they were going to feel a sense of closure, that justice would be done. But then when the actual sentence was carried out and the prisoner was put to death, most of them said, in fact 97.5% of them, said that they felt completely empty and ambivalent. So maybe we need to rethink the reason that we do this punishing thing. Why are people in jail? Yeah, I know, you goddamn joker, because they commit crimes. It's a science man right there. I get it. Actually, the answer really isn't as simple as that. In fact, in order to answer the question of why people are in jail, we first have to answer a different question. Why do people commit crime? I think when people talk about what to do with someone who's just committed a crime, we tend to take a very narrow focus and look at the incident in a vacuum. We kind of look at it and say, person commits crime, person goes to jail. But really what we should do as a society is widen our field of view so that we can see all the events that happened before the crime. And then we can maybe explain how and why that crime occurred. Because if we're not looking at why a crime happens, then how can we possibly prevent the same thing from happening again? The biggest challenge to reducing crime and victims comes from us. Well, actually I'm a science man, so my head's screwed on right. But largely it's down to society and our inability to accept different methods of dealing with crime and punishment. It's almost unfathomable for most people to think about showing a criminal compassion and empathy. Criminal needs to be punished. Criminal needs to have luxury stripped away, needs to have freedom stripped away. And for some people, they need to have their rights stripped away too, after all. Isn't that what they did to their victims? It's a real seductive kind of thinking, and it's very difficult to escape from. I myself used to believe in retributive justice throughout my teenage years and most of my 20s too. As I got older, my mind started to change a little bit and my mentality started to shift, even before I started researching this video. Now I don't care about punishment. Don't care about punishment. What I care about is a lot more simple and a lot easier to look at. Victim and harm reduction, that's it. I don't care who gets punished or how they get punished. I only care about reducing the amount of victims in the system. That's it. You show me the solution which has the greatest effect on reducing victims, and I will vote for it, even if it is completely contrary to my own personal beliefs on crime and punishment. And that brings us to our friends in Norway and Singapore. So what are those guys doing so well that the rest of us are doing so badly? The main difference between Norway, Singapore and the rest of the world is that they view the loss of freedom as the applicable punishment, and all the other stuff, you know, the nasty conditions, that's excessive and unnecessary. This is something that maybe we can all relate to a little bit more now, since we've all been in quarantine for such a long period of time. It's kind of felt a bit like jail, let's be totally honest. But at the same time, we've been stuck at home with all of our modern trappings. You know, we've had computers, we've had TVs, we've had Netflix, you can cook meals when you want, you can see your wife when you want. But we all feel as though being stuck in quarantine is pretty harsh. That's because loss of freedom itself is an ample punishment. In Norwegian prisons, prisoners can come and go around the jail as they please. They can go to other jail cells, they have the keys to their own jail cell. Inside their cells they have PlayStations, they have nice beds, they have TVs, they have private bathrooms. They're even allowed to go to the kitchen and cook their own meals and have access to sharp knives. And they have less stabbings than American prisons where no one has knives. For most people here in the UK, and I'm gonna guess and say the rest of the world that has similar systems and attitudes to here, the idea of showing this kind of treatment to a violent criminal who's just assaulted an old lady feels morally abhorrent. But that's because you're still thinking about avenging the old lady. Once you start to think about the real goal of prison, your mind starts to shift a little bit. Repeat after me. The goal is victim reduction. In Norway, convicts aren't required to disclose a criminal record to a future employer unless the person is applying for a job with the government, the education system, or the medical system. And even then, it doesn't prevent them from getting the job, it just means they have to report the crime to their employer. And considering there is less stigma about criminal records in Norway, most of the time it doesn't prevent someone from getting that job as long as they're qualified for it. The whole idea behind this system is that you should only be judged by how suitable you are for the job and not from your history. In fact, the entire mentality in Norway isn't to punish people at all, it's to facilitate them back into society and to make them a valuable and contributing member of that society. And when you think about it, from the criminal's perspective, which society are you more likely to reintegrate into? The one which has treated you with hostility and judgment, or the one that's helped you? If we learn to behave as a response to environmental stimulus around us, then consider this. Which of these two jails is more likely to produce a violent reoffender? Jail number 1, in which you fight tooth and nail for basic things like cigarettes or a bar of soap, where you're going to be assaulted or raped on a daily basis, where you're going to be fearful at all times and you're going to be worried about what's going to happen next, where you're beaten by guards, humiliated and treated with derision, or jail number 2, which is kind of like a mediocre hotel. If your answer to that was jail number 1, then you're more fucked up than the people we lock away. There is no situation in the world where we can put a person in a violent situation and they come out of it less violent. You're fucking crazy. In Singapore, they actually go a step further than this and they provide degree level education for free to every single inmate in every single jail. The idea behind this is that if you have a degree, you're more employable when you leave jail and therefore you're less likely to reoffend. In Singaporean prisons, you also don't have to serve your sentence in prison. You can serve your sentence at home with your family. There are obviously restrictions as to what you can and can't do and you have to stick to those pretty religiously. But as long as you do, you can serve out your sentence at home, where you can still feel connected to the community, to your family, to your friends, to society in general. Again, the idea is that if you're connected to community and society, you're less likely to reoffend against it. Denmark started the exact same rehabilitative change not too long ago and reduced their recidivism rate down from the 40% area all the way down to 27% using the exact same techniques that have been so successful in Norway. I read an interesting quote from the warden of Bastøy prison in Norway, and the minute I read it, it made sense. He said, if you treat people like dirt, they'll behave like dirt. If you treat them like human beings, they'll behave like human beings. Doesn't that just make sense? Just to me, I don't know, maybe I'm weird. Criminals in most societies are punished by being sent to jail. They're then punished again with the harsh conditions in jail and the violence in jail and the solitary confinement in jail. They're made to feel distant and detached from humanity and society. Then when they come out of jail, they're punished again when there's no job prospects with any kind of a future. They have the crappiest jobs to apply for with the crappiest wages. And sometimes the bosses who take on these criminal convicts kind of abuse the system and force these convicts to work for illegally low wages under the threat of reporting them for parole violation if they don't. With enough time passing, these convicts who are being forced to work for illegally low wages in jobs that aren't really good enough to pay their bills eventually they get into debt in order to try and pay for their house or their car or whatever it is that they have. That is, of course, assuming that they can get any line of credit, because it's very difficult to get credit when you have a criminal conviction. You're shunned and judged by all of the people in your normal society, and so you have no friends either. Eventually, you're faced with two choices, two bad choices. Choice number one, you can carry on as you are and hope that something magically changes to make your situation better and you can keep a roof over your head. Choice number two, you can go back to the life of crime where nobody judges you, where nobody shuns you, where it's quite easy to make money. But there is going to be a lot of victims in the process. And I know this sounds like an unrealistic situation, but there's a lot of anecdotal reports of inmates being released from prison, going to their work placement at their new job, only to be told that they're going to work for legally low wages, and they'll just get reported for parole violations if they don't. And I know what you're saying, you might be saying, well, just report it because that's blackmail, it's illegal. Who the hell's going to believe a convict, and who the hell's going to care? The only way to change this is to change the way you think about crime and punishment and the justice system. To spit everything out that you've ever been taught and be ready to accept something new. It gets a bit easier if you just ask yourself a simple question. Do I want this criminal to hurt more people or not? If the answer is no, then surely we should be looking at the solution which reduces that to the lowest possible amount. And not just sticking with what we've got because it's what we're familiar with. I know you. Yeah, you. I know you. Right now, you're sitting there thinking of reasons to carry on sitting there and do nothing. Change nothing. Maybe you're thinking, system's never going to be perfect, right? Why bother changing it? It works for about half the time. Let's not bother. There's no point. But that's a lazy bullshit reason. It's an excuse, really. Of course, it's not going to be perfect. No one expects it to be perfect. That's a straw man argument. Shouldn't we strive to make it 99%? At the very least, shouldn't we strive for it to be better than it is right now? Think of it this way. If your boss came to you tomorrow and said, Dave, we've decided we're never going to give you another pay rise for the rest of your life because, you're never going to be a millionaire. So there's really no point in us giving you more money because, you're good as you are. You're doing all right. You don't need the extra money. You ain't going to be a millionaire. You don't need it. No, you ain't going to accept that, are you? You're going to find yourself a new job. Maybe you're sitting there thinking, it's not my problem. I'm never going to commit a crime. This doesn't affect me. Well, you're a fucking moron. Because crime can still be committed against you. Of course it's still your goddamn problem. And also, weren't you listening for the first hour of this video where we talked all about how innocent people go to jail for crimes they didn't commit all the fucking time? Maybe you're the worst fucking kind of lazy. And you're sitting there right now thinking, well, what can I do? I'm just one man. I have no power, no control, no influence. I can't do anything. There's no point trying. You make sure that when you vote, and you should goddamn vote, it's literally the only influence that you have in life to shape the society that you live in. So you make sure that when you vote for the party that commits to changing the system into something better. But what's the point? They're just gonna lie to me. They're gonna tell me they'll do it to get my vote and then they won't do it anyway. There's no point. So make them a goddamn liar. Give them that responsibility. Don't just let them saunter through their entire political career using your tax money to expense multiple houses and go on multiple luxurious vacations, all the while never being forced to live up to any promises whatsoever. Make them a fucking liar. At the very least, think of it this way. If you never ask them to make a promise, then it's definitely never going to change. But if you tell them that they have to promise to make a change in order to get your vote and stay into power, well, at least there's the tiniest fraction of a percent that thing might actually change. It can be better. And we can reduce the amount of victims that are caught up in this big system. It isn't even hypothetical. 3 countries are already doing this. We can already see the results of how we can change and what happens when we do change. We just have to start doing it. At the very least, we have to try. I'd like to say thanks if you made it this far into the end of the video. This was a super long video. I experimented a bit with a lot of different things. So I apologize if this was different to what you were expecting. Hopefully people found it informative and they enjoyed it, and you'll do all the usual YouTube bullshit like subscribe, comment, blah, blah, blah. That's it for now. I'll catch you in the next video.